Do I need to do anything for the camera?
John, does Nick need
No,
to
we've moved beyond that.
We could ask you to do all kinds of things if you wanted. It's one of those moments.
So obviously as one of the Internationale narrators, we're asked to think about a term that sort of resonates with the thinking of the museum in particular. And I was also asked to somehow engage or think about our own constituencies in the formulation of this term. So the simplest and easiest way to do that, I suppose, without bringing people here, was just to have a conversation with a particular group that we are working with, called the Umbrella Network, who are a group of social designers, and with Gemma Medina, who's an independent researcher, I think some of you know, who works with this group. So kind of through that conversation, a number of terms were proposed by them, and we discussed them, and we arrived at this term agency. And I suppose agency is also, it's important to say, it's really not a new term for the Van Aber. We used it as part of our policy paper to the City Council. It was one of 3 core values that we defined to the City Council, along with transparency and dispersion. So, and I suppose in the museum we've been talking about agency in the context of trying to define a role for art, its institutions and its publics, that runs counter to the notion of autonomous art imposed on art by Western modernism. So it's within that context that this question of agency is somehow in the museum, but feels particularly resonant when talking about the notion of constituencies. And also maybe just a slight disclaimer, I'm not a philosopher or a theorist, so as I use the word agency, forgive me if I make some banalizations. So what are the motivations and implications for foregrounding constituencies in the museum? As the preamble on the Glossary website suggests, it's part of an attempted shift away, quote, from a hierarchical, top-down and broadcast-based model of knowledge dissemination, where a museum's constituents can play a formative role. In this sense, it feels like it's part of the institution coming to terms with the limitations of its founding model, not only in terms of the type of knowledge it produces, through the historically or geographically limited scope of its collections, and archives, for example, but the modes of dissemination and exchange it uses: exhibitions, publications, symposia. Opening up the museum to constituents and constituent power means a substantial, and we would argue welcome, reorientation of emphasis for the museum. It would seem to suggest a new focus away from collections and exhibitions to a foregrounding of relationships with those who have a political and cultural stake in the museum. Significantly, it means not only understanding who our constituencies are, but also forming positions and arguments with them. However, for this to be meaningful, the terms of the relationship are crucial in understanding how constituencies might work with or through museums and vice versa. It is here we propose the term agency. In its simplest terms, agency can be understood as one's ability to act. Yet when considering how museums might work with constituencies, this ability to act has wider implications. What agency can an institution foster with its set protocols, formats, and languages? Who decides the conditions for this relationship? Or who defines the relationship? Setting the potential and limitations for agency to be enacted. And what agency does the museum itself hold to operate in new ways with constituencies, tied as it might be, or think it might be, by different obligations to funders, partners, or governments, or simply obligations or connections to historical models of the museum? With these and other questions in mind, agency seems a potentially cogent term with which to explore what working with and through constituencies might mean, both for the museum and its constituents. So the foregrounding of relationships within the museum does not mean making it the subject or medium through which to make an art project. So I think Ahmed's comment around the silent university yesterday made clear. We are not discussing relational works or practices. Similarly, the types of relationships that this work points to or is aiming at seem something different from audience development and engagement, where institutions define their goals through the numbers they can bring through the doors, or it needs to be careful that it doesn't sort of ape this approach under different rhetoric. Rather, it aims to recast the institution and its public as constituent parts in a wider social body. Or we could say that in relation to practices as audience development or accumulation, it is attempting to politicize its relationship with this audience. And we can discuss the merits of doing that. Within this social body, the museum needs to work incredibly hard to recast itself and the types of relationships it normally has, with artists, audiences, funders, whose roles and expectations are more clearly defined and understood. And I think this kind of understanding of one's roles is key to what I'm going to talk about now. So if the museum takes seriously the claim of placing relations at the core of its practice, then it seems the first task would be in understanding that a museum, now more than ever, cannot define its subjects. It's something we started talking a little bit about yesterday. And I think maybe with that said, it's perhaps revealing that this term constituencies is also something that the museums themselves have come up with. So even within this subject, we've already defined this term for our constituents. Here it might be interesting to think about a recent text by Stacey Douglas, an American academic in legal studies, which makes comparisons between the museum and the Constitution. In the text, Douglas argues that interesting similarities can be drawn between museums and constitutions. She opens her text, quote, "Museums function much like constitutions. Although they are not accorded the same juridical powers as the state-sanctioned constitution, nor they recognize social contracts upon which the national judicial apparatus sits, they do operate as a site from which imaginations of political community are launched. Indeed, they are alike, as both set the representation of political community as their task." A museum has conventionally done this through its collections and archives and the types of exhibitions it programs. Constitutions similarly try to communicate the idea of a society and the type of people within it, Douglas argues. Both, however, are accused of being intrinsically exclusionary. As any public or people is defined, so another is excluded. This is what we were talking about yesterday, the need for each generation in a way to rewrite its own constitution. In the case of the museum, its memorializing foundations were built on the legacies of colonialism and imperialism, and the museum itself is very much tied to the formation of the nation state, which is something I was sort of pointing at yesterday. So Stacey Douglas goes on, lastly, museums and constitutional democracy share a common link with the advent of liberalism. For both, the revolutionary moment of secular statehood marks an organizational change, but one that allows sovereign hierarchies to persist. Written constitutions, too, are often accused of excluding or erasing, Douglas argues, whole communities. What this comparison makes clear is that the Constitution itself can be thought of as far more than an institutional document. It appears, in fact, as a memorializing mechanism, a way of fixing histories, subjects, or even political communities. Something that I think Kwesi talked about in his talk yesterday. If we take Douglas's comparison seriously, which I think it's worth doing, the question of how a museum understands, identifies, or defines its constituencies, the type of relationship that definition fosters, and the subsequent bearing that has on what is possible through that relationship seems vital. And I think that's again something that we started pointing to yesterday in relation to the idea of a universal subject. And it's here I want to evoke the spirit of our dear friend Jesus, and quote a little bit from a recent text that he has written for a reader that will be published soon that came out of projects with Reina Sofia and the Van Abbe and Hildesheim, called What's the Use? So Jesus writes in relation to the museum and particularly the Reina Sofia and its the way that it defined its subject. He writes, quote, "Even if we, the team at the museum at this time, chose not to speak to the affluent class, nor to an undifferentiated mass of tourists, it is true that we still address a subject defined in terms of lack, a disempowered subject, imagined in relation to or in contrast with the luminous subject defined by the Enlightenment. It is the subject inflicted upon by the alienating conditions and struggles of late capitalism, who, with the aid of the museum, would become aware of the ideological nature of the system we live in, starting with the art world and the museum itself," and he puts in parenthesis, institutional critique, end quote. And I think it's maybe interesting also to think about that in relation to what Steven was talking about yesterday in terms of this relationship between rights and duty, that somehow that the museum could be seen as the place that would allow this transformation within these subjects to take place. And I think that's what Jesus is critiquing in a way. Jesus goes on, and here it's very important in relation to the question of agency. To an extent, our task then is to provide critical tools to understand a system which we may not have the capacity to change. Would we be ready to deal with a new kind of subject, not defined by deprivation, but by expectations and desires, which go beyond the apparent imminence of current capitalism? Would we be ready to deal with a subject that is already experimenting with other forms of organization and producing its own imaginaries? What if the South started making sense of the world beyond and without our mediations? Could the museum still be a suitable scenario for the performance of this new subjectivity? This is very much an open question, end quote. And I think that's really what we're talking about yesterday. Even if we did have the tools and willingness to engage constituencies in the way that we're talking about, would we be ready for what that might induce? Are we really ready for what we're asking for, basically? Which I think is something that Raoul touched on again yesterday. So to return a little bit to the analogy with the Constitution, in the shift to working with and through constituencies, a complex move is being made. On the one hand, the focus away from collections and exhibitions to relationships opens up the possibility for relationships that are not defined through the geographical or political scope of archives and programs. On the other, we are letting go of the tools that museums have used for so long to structure what Stacey Douglas calls a site from which imaginations of political community are launched. Some would argue that's a good thing, but I think that acknowledgement needs to take place. And I think it's worth thinking about Negri's view on constitutionalism in the way that I understand that he talks about it in Insurgencies. I mean, he would argue that constituencies' ability or their agency, what he talks about as facilitating historical rupture, becomes curtailed through constitutionalism. And again, it's this need to constantly rewrite. And I think it's something that was also mentioned specifically in the Charter for Europe. And one of the stated aims was to, and here's a little quote, attempt at collectively elaborating on the central problem for political organization and agency outside the representational sphere. So how can we think about this question of agency outside the representational sphere? And the representational sphere within the museum is traditionally through collections, archives, and programs to a certain extent. In that sense, we could say there is a need to break the shackles of the museum's relationship to the constitution or the representational sphere, as defined through its collections, archives, and programs, if we want to foster forms of political agency or facilitate historical rupture in Negri's work. Yet as museums try and move away from the representational sphere, the terms of the relationship become less clear. This lack of definition is both a strength and a danger. And I think I was reading in preparation for this some of the notes that were in the Barcelona meeting with the different constituency groups, and one of the kind of most striking things about reading those notes was this question of lack of clarity in the relationships between constituents and museums, and this lack of definition, which is, both a potential but also a weakness, particularly if you're not in the position of power of the museums. Are these constituencies being asked to perform a role, have a dialogue, or perform labour, as I think we'll discuss further in a moment? In this sense, a shift to working with and through constituencies should be seen as an acknowledgement of the inadequacy of the type of presuppositions Carrillo talks about, given the recent emergence of new forms of political subjectivities, and in particular do not see themselves in terms of any form of lack. Similarly, as Carrillo's text makes apparent, it is not entirely clear that even if we are able to understand the situation we find ourselves in, do we, either institutions or as part of a constituent social body, have the ability and willingness to act? Thank you.